Imagine it's 1783. The smoke from the Revolutionary War has barely cleared. The United States has won its independence on the battlefield, but in the schoolhouses, American children are still reciting British textbooks, praising the king, and spelling words like honor and theater. One man, a struggling 25-year-old teacher from Connecticut named Noah Webster, looks at his students and realizes something chilling. America is independent, but its mind is still colonized. He decides to do something radical. He doesn't pick up a musket, he picks up a pen. He sets out to create a secular Bible for the new nation, a book that would teach Americans how to speak, spell, and think for themselves. It would become the most influential book in American history after the Bible. This is the story of the blue-backed speller and the war for the American tongue. The Paper Rebel. The year was 1782. Noah Webster was broke. He had a law degree he couldn't use because the economy was in shambles, and he was stuck teaching unruly children in a drafty schoolhouse in Goshen, New York. Every day he handed out copies of Dilworth's Guide, a British textbook. It was filled with references to London streets, British dukes, and the Anglican Church. Webster watched his students struggle with the complex elitist spelling and the foreign cultural references. To him, this wasn't just a matter of education, it was a matter of national survival. America must be as independent in literature as she is in politics, he muttered to himself. He began to envision a three-part system: a speller, a grammar book, and a reader. He called it a grammatical institute of the English language. But there was a problem. In 1783, there were no national copyright laws. If Webster published his book, anyone could steal it, print it, and he wouldn't see a dime. To save the American language, he first had to do something no one had ever done. He had to lobby every single state legislature to protect the rights of authors. While the Founding Fathers were busy debating the Constitution, Webster was on horseback, traveling from town to town, carrying his manuscript like a sacred relic. He was awkward, arrogant, and often dismissed as a nuisance, but he had a vision of a unified American dialect that would bind the 13 fractured states together. By the time he returned to Hartford to publish the first part, The Speller, he wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a linguistic insurgent. The first edition of The Speller hit the streets of Hartford, Connecticut in October 1783. It wasn't an immediate literary masterpiece. It was a thin, cheaply bound book with a dull blue paper cover. But inside those pages, Noah Webster was committing an act of linguistic treason against the British Crown. Webster's plan was simple but devastatingly effective. He began to strip away the aristocratic flourishes of English spelling. He hated the silent letters that served no purpose other than to show off one's expensive education. Why write honor when the U was silent? Why music with a K at the end? To the elite, this was low class and barbaric. To Webster, it was American. He wanted a language that was as practical and straightforward as the pioneers who were currently pushing westward. But the Speller wasn't just a list of words, it was a manual for citizenship. Between the columns of syllables, ba, be, bo, boo, Webster inserted moral fables and federal lessons. He replaced British history with the names of American rivers, American heroes, and American virtues. He was literally teaching children how to be Americans before the country even had a president. The book's success was terrifyingly fast. It spread through the colonies like a fever. Mothers in log cabins in Kentucky used it to teach their children by the light of the fireplace. Teachers in Boston used it to standardize the chaotic dialects of their students. For the first time, a child in Georgia and a child in New Hampshire were learning to spell and speak the exact same way. However, fame brought enemies. The spelling wars began in the newspapers. Critics mocked him, calling him a literary upstart and a pedantic coxcomb. They accused him of trying to destroy the majesty of the English language. Webster didn't back down.
He was a man of intense, almost unbearable vanity, and he thrived on the conflict. He viewed every critic as a British sympathizer. But while the critics shouted, the people bought. The blue-backed speller was becoming the bedrock of American literacy, and Webster was becoming the most famous man in America that most people had never met. Yet, as the money finally started to trickle in, Webster realized that a single book wasn't enough to unite a nation. He needed to go deeper. He needed to tackle the very structure of how Americans thought, the grammar. By 1784, the speller was a runaway hit, but Noah Webster was restless. He wasn't satisfied with just teaching children how to spell apple and liberty. He wanted to build a cultural fortress. He released the second part of his institute, the grammar. If the speller was the brick of the American language, the grammar was the mortar. But this was where Webster hit a wall. In the 18th century, grammar was seen as a divine, unchanging set of rules based on Latin. To change the rules of grammar was seen as an attack on civilization itself. Webster disagreed. He argued that language should be defined by how people actually spoke, not by the dead rules of ancient Rome or the snobbery of London high society. Grammar is formed on language and not language on grammar, he declared. This was a populist revolution. He was telling the common American farmer that his way of speaking was just as correct as a British lord's. But the work was exhausting. Webster was traveling constantly, often on foot or horseback, through rain and snow to promote his books and lobby for copyright laws. He was lonely, broke. Despite the book's success, the lack of national laws meant he was being cheated by rogue printers, and increasingly paranoid. In Philadelphia, he sought the ultimate validation. He went to see Benjamin Franklin. The meeting was a turning point. Franklin, a man who loved a good practical invention, saw the genius in Webster's madness. Franklin had even played with his own phonetic alphabet years prior. He encouraged Webster, giving the young teacher the political blessing he needed to keep going. With Franklin's backing, Webster's ego reached new heights. He started seeing himself as the founding father of American culture. He wasn't just a teacher anymore. He was a self-appointed guardian of the national spirit. He started writing political essays, advising George Washington, and arguing that the United States needed a strong central government to match its strong new language. However, a dark cloud was gathering. The very Americanism he preached was about to be tested. The states were bickering, the economy was collapsing, and a rival group of scholars was preparing to launch a smear campaign to destroy Webster's New English before it could take root. As the 1780s drew to a close, the United States was a mess of competing currencies and bickering states. Noah Webster watched this chaos with a growing sense of dread. He realized that a unified language was useless if the country itself fell apart. Webster stopped being just a bookman and became a political warrior. He moved to New York and founded the American Minerva, the city's first daily newspaper. He used his platform to shout at the public, demanding they support the new Constitution. He was a Federalist through and through. He believed in order, authority, and a strong central power. But his political life was making him a target. The spelling wars of the past were nothing compared to the political blood sport of the 1990s. Because Webster was so vocal, his enemies found a new way to hurt him. They attacked his speller. They called it Webster's Whims. Rival publishers launched a smear campaign, claiming that Webster was trying to bastardize English to isolate America from the civilized world. They whispered that his simplified spellings were the mark of an uneducated mind. The pressure was immense. Webster was working 16 hours a day, editing a newspaper, raising a growing family, and constantly revising his institute. He became more irritable, more stubborn, and more convinced that he was the only person who could save the American soul. Then a massive blow struck. A rival grammar book by Lindley Murray, an American living in England, was released. Murray's book was safe. It kept the British spellings. It was elegant. It was everything the elite wanted. Suddenly, Webster's Institute was under threat of being replaced in the very schools he had worked so hard to reach. Webster retreated. He realized he couldn't just tell people how to spell and talk. He had to prove why American English was superior. He needed a project so massive, so undeniable, that it would bury his critics forever. He decided to define every single word used by Americans. He wasn't just going to write a textbook anymore. He was going to write a dictionary. But this task would take more than a few years. It would take decades. It would take him to the brink of madness, cost him his reputation, and force him to learn 28 different languages just to find the roots of American identity. Noah Webster was no longer the young, fire-eyed rebel who had traveled from schoolhouse to schoolhouse. By the early 1800s, he had become a man obsessed. He moved his family to New Haven, Connecticut, and later to Amherst, Massachusetts, seeking a quiet place where he could engage in a task that most people thought was impossible for one man to achieve. He stood at a specially built circular desk that allowed him to rotate between dozens of open books. For hours on end, he stood, never sitting for fear of becoming sluggish, tracing the lineage of words. To truly define American English, he believed he had to understand the parent languages. So, at the age of 50, he began to teach himself Anglo-Saxon, Sanskrit, Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, Latin, and nearly 22 others. The world outside was changing. Thomas Jefferson was president. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the nation, and the Industrial Revolution was beginning to hum. But Webster remained in his study, a ghost haunted by the alphabet. His obsession came at a heavy price. His finances were a disaster. He was living off the meager royalties of the blue-backed speller, which, despite being used by millions, was constantly being pirated by unscrupulous printers. His social life withered. He became increasingly eccentric, walking the streets of New Haven and counting the houses just for the sake of accuracy, or correcting the speech of strangers he overheard at the market. People began to mock him. They called him Noah's Ark, a man trapped in a wooden room with his words while the rest of the world moved on. His critics in the dictionary war were louder than ever, claiming that his attempt to change the spelling of words like jail instead of gale and color instead of color was the work of a lunatic trying to isolate America from the history of Western civilization. But then tragedy struck. In the midst of his work, he faced personal loss and the realization that his monumental task might never be finished. He was an old man now, his hair white, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of ancient lexicons. He realized that if he died now, the American language would remain a messy, fractured thing, still tethered to the shadow of the British Empire. Driven by a final burst of Federalist energy, he pushed himself to the limit. He wasn't just defining words anymore, he was defining the American soul. He added words that had never appeared in a British dictionary: skunk, hickory, chowder, caucus. In 1828, the massive 2-volume set of An American Dictionary of the English Language was finally published. It was the culmination of 28 years of solitude and a lifetime of defiance. Noah Webster was 70 years old, an age where most men had long since retired, yet he had just delivered the final blow in the war for American independence. The dictionary was a masterpiece of cultural engineering. He didn't just fix spellings like center and defense. He gave Americans a common vocabulary for their unique landscape. He included terms for American plants, American government, and the American spirit. He proved that the way a farmer in Ohio spoke was not a debased version of the King's English. It was a legitimate, powerful language of its own. But the struggle wasn't over. The dictionary was expensive, $20, a small fortune at the time. Sales were slow at first. Webster had to mortgage his home just to keep the project alive. He spent his final years traveling, once again to promote his work, a silver-haired ghost of the Revolution, still fighting for his vision. In May 1843, Noah Webster passed away. He died as he lived, surrounded by books, still revising his work, still convinced that the United States could only be truly free if it shared a single, clear language. He didn't live to see the full impact of his labor. After his death, the rights to his dictionary were bought by George and Charles Merriam, who turned it into the global institution we know today as Merriam-Webster. But his real monument wasn't the dictionary. It was the blue-backed speller. By the time it went out of print, it had sold nearly 100 million copies. It became the most popular secular book in the history of American publishing. It standardized the speech of a melting pot nation, allowing millions of immigrants and pioneers to communicate with one another. Every time you type color instead of color, every time you use a uniquely American phrase, and every time you feel a sense of national identity through the words you speak, you are using the tools Noah Webster built. He was a man who was often unloved, arrogant, stubborn, and obsessed, but he understood a truth that still resonates today. To control a nation's future, you must first define its words. The war that began in 1776 was won on the battlefield, but it was finished in a schoolhouse by a man with a blue-covered book and a dream of an American voice.
Chapter 7. The Copyright Crusader, the War Against the Pirates. While Webster was revolutionizing the alphabet, he was also fighting a hidden war that would change the American legal system forever. This is the chapter of the Great Theft. In the 1780s, America was the Wild West of publishing. There were no national copyright laws. As soon as Noah Webster's speller became a hit, printers in different states began to pirate his work. They would print thousands of copies, sell them, and keep every penny for themselves. The man who was teaching the nation how to read was practically starving because he couldn't protect his own ideas. Webster was furious. He didn't just want to be a teacher, he wanted to be an author who could survive on his craft. He realized that to save his book, he had to change the law of the land. He became a political lobbyist on horseback. He traveled from state to state, New Jersey, New Hampshire, New York, South Carolina, knocking on the doors of governors and legislators. He argued that a man's thoughts were his property, just like a farmer's land or a merchant's ship. At one point, he even visited George Washington at Mount Vernon. He didn't just talk about spelling, he talked about the intellectual dignity of the new nation. He convinced the Founding Fathers that if America didn't protect its writers, it would never have its own culture. His relentless pestering worked. Webster's personal quest for book royalties led directly to the Copyright Act of 1790. Every time a modern creator, whether a YouTuber, an author, or a musician, claims copyright on their work, they are standing on the shoulders of Noah Webster. He didn't just give us the words, he fought for the right of every American to own their own voice and get paid for their genius. He proved that in America, an idea was worth as much as gold, but only if you were brave enough to defend it. By the time Noah Webster was deep into the dictionary years, the light of the young revolutionary had begun to dim, replaced by a much harsher, colder fire. This is the chapter of the isolated genius. Webster was not a well-loved man. As he aged, his Federalist pride curdled into a deep distrust of the very people he was writing for. He looked at the growing American democracy and saw mob rule. He became a religious zealot, convinced that the American language wasn't just a tool for trade, but a tool for God. He began to purge his dictionary of anything he found immoral. He rewrote definitions to fit his strict moral code. He became so obsessed with purity that he even tried to rewrite the entire Bible, removing words he found offensive or vulgar. This wasn't just a man writing a book anymore. This was a man trying to play God with the English language. His family felt the weight of his obsession. His children grew up in a house of silence, where the only sound was the scratching of their father's quill and the turning of heavy, dusty pages.
He was physically there, but his mind was lost in the 2nd century, tracing the etymology of words that no one else cared about. The mental toll was staggering. There were nights when Webster would stare at a single word for hours, convinced that if he got the definition wrong, the entire structure of American civilization would crumble. He suffered from bouts of deep depression and nervous exhaustion. In his mind, he was a martyr. He believed he was sacrificing his wealth, his health, and his reputation to give America a soul. He wrote in his diary about being neglected and misunderstood. He saw himself as a lonely lighthouse keeper on a dark, stormy coast, holding a lamp that the rest of the country was trying to blow out. But this darkness is what gave the dictionary its weight. It wasn't written by a committee or a government agency. It was forged in the loneliness and the near madness of a man who believed that without him, America would literally lose its ability to think. He was the American Dr. Johnson, but with a chip on his shoulder the size of the New World. He was ready for the final battle, the publication that would either make him a god or a laughingstock. The year 1828 was not just an election year, it was the year of the American linguistic earthquake. After 28 years of standing at his desk, Noah Webster finally released his 2-volume American Dictionary of the English Language. He was 70 years old. Most of the men he had started the Revolution with, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, were dead. He was a relic of a past age, standing in a new, raw America. But when he opened those first printed copies, he wasn't looking at the past. He was looking at the future. The dictionary contained 70,000 words. That was 12,000 more than any British dictionary in existence. But it wasn't the quantity that shocked the world. It was the defiance. Webster had officially codified the American way. He removed the U from honor, the K from music, and reversed the RE in theater. To the British press, this was an act of literary vandalism. They mocked him as a madman from Connecticut who was trying to break the English language into pieces. Even at home, the reception was a battlefield. The Harvard elite in Boston looked down their noses at him. They thought his spellings were vulgar and common. They preferred the British style because it made them feel sophisticated. But Webster knew something they didn't. He knew the heart of the country wasn't in the salons of Boston, it was in the schoolhouses of the frontier. He took his dictionary on a tour. He went to Washington, D.C., and showed it to the members of Congress. He stood before them, a tall, thin man with a sharp nose and piercing eyes, and told them that they could not have a national identity without a national language. He was the salesman of the American soul. Then came the miracle. Despite the high price of $20, the dictionary began to sell, not just to scholars, but to lawyers who needed precise definitions for the new American laws, and to writers who wanted to describe the American experience. But as the fame grew, so did the dictionary wars. A rival named Joseph Worcester released a dictionary that was more British-friendly, and the two men entered a bitter, decades-long feud that divided the country. This wasn't just about spelling anymore. It was a fight for the monopoly of the American mind. Webster spent his final years in a frenzy of work, constantly updating, constantly fighting. He knew his time was running out, but he had one final secret weapon: the children. He knew that if he could keep the blue-backed speller in the hands of every child, the dictionary would eventually win.
By 1843, the old lion was tired. Noah Webster was 84 years old. He had spent 60 years of his life fighting for words, and his body was finally giving out. On his deathbed in New Haven, he wasn't surrounded by gold or political honors. He was surrounded by piles of paper, inkwells, and the latest revisions for his next edition. When he took his last breath, many thought the Webster era was over. His dictionary, while famous, was a financial mess. He had died with significant debt, and his family didn't have the business sense to manage his massive literary estate. For a moment, it looked like his rival, Joseph Worcester, would win the dictionary war and pull America back toward British English.
Enter the Merriam brothers. George and Charles Merriam were two printers from Springfield, Massachusetts. They weren't scholars or linguists, they were businessmen. They saw what no one else did. Noah Webster's name was the most powerful brand in America. They bought the rights to his dictionary for a pittance, but they inherited a mountain of unorganized notes and a reputation for brilliance. The Merriams did something Webster never would have done. They hired a team. They turned the solitary work of a mad genius into a corporate machine. They stripped away his preachy religious rants and kept his scientific precision. They made the dictionary smaller, cheaper, and more accessible to the average American worker. But the dictionary war turned into a literal street fight. The Merriams and the supporters of the rival Worcester dictionary fought in the newspapers, in school board meetings, and in the halls of Congress. They accused each other of linguistic poisoning. The turning point came when the Merriams realized the power of the unabridged. In 1859, they added illustrations, the first time a dictionary used pictures to define reality. They made the dictionary so essential that every court of law in the United States began using Webster's as the final authority on what words actually meant. By the time the American Civil War broke out, Webster's wasn't just a book, it was an institution. It survived the fire of the war, and when the smoke cleared, it was the only dictionary left standing. The Merriam-Webster Company had won. Noah Webster had wanted to unite the country through his spirit. The Merriam brothers united it through their marketing. The man had died, but the brand was born. A brand that would eventually find its way into every classroom, every office, and eventually every search engine on the planet. By the turn of the 20th century, the blue-backed spether had done its job. It had standardized the speech of a continent. But now a new phenomenon was beginning. American English was escaping the borders of the United States. As America rose to become a global superpower, Noah Webster's simplified English became the language of the machine age. When the Wright brothers took flight and the Ford Model T began to roll off assembly lines, the manuals were written in the spelling of Webster. The world was beginning to realize that Webster's dream of a practical language was perfect for a fast-moving industrial world. Then came the two world wars. Millions of American soldiers landed on foreign shores, carrying their slang, their songs, and their dictionaries. In the wreckage of post-war Europe and Asia, Webster's English became the language of Reconstruction, jazz, and Hollywood. The British honor and theater began to look old-fashioned, while the American honor and theater looked like the future. In 1947, a massive decision was made that would seal Webster's victory forever: international aviation. It was decided that English would be the universal language of the skies. Because of the dominance of American technology, the standard definitions and spellings used by pilots from Paris to Tokyo were rooted in the work of that lone teacher from Connecticut. But the final victory happened in a place Webster could never have imagined: the digital frontier. When the first computer codes were written and the first protocols for the Internet, ARPANET, were established, they were built by American engineers. They used American spellings. Today, every line of code written in CSS uses the command color, not color. Every database in the world is organized using the logic of a man who died before the light bulb was even invented. Noah Webster wanted to free America from a king. He ended up giving the world a tool for the information age. He proved that language is the most powerful technology ever invented. It doesn't just describe the world, it builds it. From a drafty schoolhouse in 1783 to the satellites orbiting the Earth today, the Grammatical Institute is still speaking. The paper rebel won his war. Chapter 12: The Ghost in the Machine, Webster in the 21st Century. In the modern world, we think of dictionaries as static, dusty relics on a library shelf. But if Noah Webster were alive today, he wouldn't be looking at a book, he would be looking at you. This is the chapter of the living language. Noah Webster's most radical idea was that a dictionary shouldn't be a prison for words, but a mirror of the people. Today, that mirror is digital. Every time a new word like selfie, ghosting, or algorithm is officially added to the dictionary, a massive debate erupts. Traditionalists scream that the language is being ruined, but this is exactly the fight Webster started in 1783. He was the first to say that if the American people are using a word to describe their reality, then that word is official. He took the power away from the academy and gave it to the street. Today, the spirit of the Grammatical Institute lives on in natural language processing, NLP, and artificial intelligence. When an AI learns to speak, it doesn't learn British English. It primarily learns the general American dialect that Webster standardized. The logic he used to categorize and define 70,000 words in his circular study is the same logic used to train the large language models of the 2020s. We are currently living through a second Webster moment. Just as the printing press and the steam engine forced Webster to redefine the language for a new republic, the internet and AI are forcing us to redefine what communication even means. Webster's ghost is there every time we argue about the meaning of a fact, every time we create a new slang term on social media, and every time we use language to assert our independence. He taught us that language is the most powerful technology ever invented. It doesn't just describe the world, it builds it. From a drafty schoolhouse in 1783 to the satellites orbiting the Earth today, the Grammatical Institute is still speaking. The paper rebel won his war.
While the dictionary was for the scholars and the grammar was for the teachers, there was one unexpected phenomenon born from the Grammatical Institute that conquered American pop culture: the spelling bee. In the early 1800s, America was a rural nation. People lived in isolated farming communities with very little entertainment. But every village had a schoolhouse, and every schoolhouse had a stack of Webster's blue-backed spellers. Teachers began to realize that the best way to get children to memorize Webster's simplified American spellings was to turn it into a sport. They called them spelling schools or spelling matches. These weren't just for kids. On Friday nights, the entire town would gather. Adults would challenge each other, standing in long lines, sweating under the pressure of words like syllable, independence, and agriculture. To spell down your neighbor was a point of immense pride. It was the Super Bowl of the frontier. This obsession did something vital for the young United States. It killed off local accents that were too thick to understand. It forced the son of a Swedish immigrant in Minnesota and the daughter of a French settler in Louisiana to agree on one thing: the Webster Standard. The spelling bee became a rite of passage. It celebrated the self-made man, the idea that even if you were born in a log cabin, if you studied your Webster, you could master the language of power. It democratized intelligence. Today, the Scripps National Spelling Bee is a televised event watched by millions. Every time a student stands on that stage and asks for the language of origin or the definition, they are participating. As the American narrative expanded, Noah Webster's influence didn't just stay on the map, it left the planet. This is the chapter of the universal standard. When the United States entered the space age in the 1960s, the mission was to put a man on the moon. But to do that, thousands of engineers, scientists, and pilots had to communicate with absolute mathematical precision. They relied on the technical vocabulary that had its roots in the clarity Webster demanded back in the 18th century.
When Neil Armstrong spoke to Mission Control from the lunar surface, he used the dialect that Webster had standardized, a clear, rhotic, general American accent. The transcripts of those historic missions are written in the spellings of the 1783 Institute. But the legacy goes even deeper. In the late 1970s, NASA launched the Voyager probes. On board, they placed a golden record containing sounds and languages of Earth, intended for any extraterrestrial civilization that might find it. The English greetings chosen for that record and the symbolic language used to describe humanity were rooted in the American definitions Webster fought for. Webster once said that language is the expression of ideas. By standardizing American English, he gave humanity a specific set of tools to express the most complex ideas in history, from physics to philosophy. If an alien civilization ever finds our records, the first human language they will likely decode is the one forged by a stubborn teacher in a drafty Connecticut room. They won't find the King's English, they will find Webster's English. The paper rebel didn't just unite 13 colonies, he gave a voice to the species as it stepped off its home planet. He proved that words are the only vessels capable of carrying our civilization across the ocean of time and space. The 1783 Grammatical Institute started as a way to teach children in a schoolhouse. It ended by providing the vocabulary for the stars. As Noah Webster entered his twilight years, his mission took a sharp, controversial turn. He had conquered the schoolhouse and the courtroom, but now he wanted to conquer the American soul. This is the chapter of the moral censor. In the early 1930s, Webster became convinced that his dictionary was incomplete because it contained words that were corrupting the youth. He began to look at the Bible itself, the most important book in America, and felt it was too British and too vulgar. He believed that the King James Version used words that were offensive to delicacy. Webster spent years producing his own version of the Bible. He changed words like teats to breasts, stink to odious smell, and whore to lewd woman. He was trying to create a sanitized American English. He wanted a language that was as clean and upright as a New England church. This move sparked a massive backlash. For the first time, the public turned on him. They felt he had gone too far, that he was trying to edit God. His Bible was a commercial failure, but the attempt revealed the true nature of his obsession. Webster didn't just want to define words, he wanted to control the vibration of American life. He feared that if the language became loose or immoral, the Republic would collapse into chaos. He saw a direct link between a child's spelling and a man's character. To Webster, a misspelled word wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign of a lazy, unpatriotic mind. Even though his clean Bible failed, this period established the Webster standard of professionalism. It's the reason why, even today, American business and academic English is known for being direct, formal, and to the point. He stripped away the flowery, poetic ambiguity of the Old World and replaced it with a language built for commerce, law, and moral clarity. He was the architect of the American proper. He taught a rough frontier nation how to speak with the dignity of a world power, even if it meant fighting with his own neighbors to do it. He proved that to change a culture, you don't just change what people say, you change what they are allowed to say.
As the sun began to set on the 19th century, the American experiment was no longer a dream, it was a roaring industrial reality. But inside the hallowed halls of New Haven, an aging Noah Webster was preparing for his most difficult battle yet, the fight for his own memory. In his final years, Webster realized that his greatest enemy wasn't the British, nor was it his rival lexicographers, it was time. He saw that the language he had worked so hard to fix was already moving past him.
New words were being born in the gold mines of California and the factories of Lowell that he didn't understand. He became a paper architect, spending his final days obsessively organizing his letters, his diaries, and his manuscripts. He was building a fortress of paper to prove to future generations that he was the one who had laid the foundation. He wrote a history of the United States and a manual of useful studies, trying to ensure that every facet of American knowledge was filtered through his perspective. On a cold night in May 1843, as the clock struck its final hour for the great wordsmith, he looked at his massive 2-volume dictionary one last time. He didn't see it as a book of definitions. He saw it as a declaration of mental independence. He had started in 1783 with a simple goal: to make sure American children didn't have to bow to British books. By 1843, he had ensured that the American mind was a fortress of its own. He died with a quill near his hand, still believing that the stability of the Republic rested on the clarity of its syllables. The paper rebel was gone, but the standard remained. He left behind a country that finally knew how to spell its own name. He left behind a people who no longer looked across the Atlantic for permission to speak. He left behind a language that was ready to conquer the world. Noah Webster didn't just write a dictionary, he wrote the operating system for America. And every time you open your mouth to speak with confidence or type a word with conviction, you are echoing the quiet scratching of his quill from a century and a half ago. By the mid-1860s, the United States was no longer a theoretical experiment, it was a slaughterhouse. The Civil War was tearing the nation apart, families were split, and the very idea of a United States seemed like a failed dream. But in the pockets of Union and Confederate soldiers alike, there was a common thread that kept the concept of America alive: the Webster's Speller and Dictionary. During the long, cold nights in the trenches of Virginia or the muddy camps of Tennessee, soldiers did two things: they cleaned their muskets and they wrote letters home. Because of Noah Webster's 1783 Institute, a farm boy from Vermont and a clerk from Ohio spelled their fears and their hopes in the exact same way. They used the same definitions for liberty, duty, and patriotism. While the politicians fought over the Constitution, the common soldier relied on Webster's language to stay connected to his humanity. The blue-backed speller became one of the most common items found on the bodies of fallen soldiers. It was more than a textbook, it was a piece of home. It was the proof that they belonged to something larger than their state. They belonged to a shared language. When the war finally ended and the country began the long, painful process of reconstruction, the dictionary played a role that no general could. It provided a neutral ground. To rebuild the South and integrate millions of formerly enslaved people into the citizenry, the government turned to education, and at the heart of that education was Webster's work. Freedmen's schools were filled with people of all ages, from children to grandparents, all holding that same blue book. For them, learning Webster's English was the ultimate act of freedom. It was the key to the law, the key to the vote, and the key to the future. Noah Webster didn't just write a dictionary, he wrote the operating system for America. And every time you open your mouth to speak with confidence or type a word with conviction, you are echoing the quiet scratching of his quill from a century and a half ago. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a new kind of war began, the war of innovation. This was the era of Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and the Wright brothers. But these inventors didn't just need copper wire and gasoline. They needed a way to describe things that had never existed before. In the Old World, scientific language was wrapped in Latin and Old World academic jargon that was designed to keep people out. But Noah Webster had built a different kind of dictionary, one that prioritized clarity and utility. He believed that if a word didn't help a man build a better plow or a more efficient stove, it wasn't doing its job. When the U.S. Patent Office became the busiest building in Washington, Webster's dictionary became the rule book of the future. Every time an inventor filed a patent, they had to define their invention with absolute precision. If the language was too vague, the patent could be stolen. Inventors turned to Webster's to find the sharpest, most undeniable definitions for their work. Because Webster had simplified English, it became the perfect language for technical manuals. American machines were being exported all over the world, and they came with instructions written in Webster's English. It was a language of how-to. Efficiency. He removed the silent, useless letters. Directness. He favored the shortest path to a meaning. Expansion. He encouraged the creation of compound words to describe new technologies. This linguistic efficiency allowed American industry to move faster than the rest of the world. While European scholars were still arguing over the proper way to spell a word, American engineers were using Webster's simplified code to build the light bulb, the telephone, and the assembly line. Noah Webster had turned the English language into a toolbox. He proved that a nation's wealth isn't just in its gold or its land, but in the precision of its technical vocabulary. He provided the blueprints for the American century, one definition at a time.
As the 20th century dawned, Webster's work took on its most subversive and powerful role yet. It moved from the hands of inventors and soldiers into the hands of those fighting for the most basic human right, the vote. In the American South, during the era of Jim Crow, literacy tests were used as a weapon to prevent black citizens from exercising their right to vote. These tests were often rigged, designed to be confusing and impossible to pass. But the activists of the civil rights movement knew that the only way to break the system was to master the very language it was written in. In freedom schools across the country, volunteers used the descendants of Webster's original speller to teach thousands of people how to read and write. They realized that standard English was the master key. If a citizen could master the vocabulary of the law, they could no longer be intimidated by a registrar at a polling station. Webster had originally designed his dictionary to free America from a king. Now, it was being used to free Americans from each other. The dictionary became a shield against oppression. When activists stood in court or wrote letters to the president, they used the Webster Standard to demand that the definitions of equality and justice be applied to everyone, not just a privileged few. This period proved that Noah Webster's greatest gift wasn't a list of words, but the democratization of knowledge. He had created a system so clear and so accessible that it could be picked up by anyone, anywhere, to claim their place in the American story. The paper rebel had provided the vocabulary for the most important revolution of all, the one that happened in the human heart, when a person realizes they have the power to speak their own truth. Chapter 20, The Final Word. Your turn. We have traveled from 1783 to the present day. We have seen how a single man's obsession with a blue-backed book built a nation, fought a war, fueled an industrial revolution, and helped win civil rights. Noah Webster's life is a reminder that the things we take for granted, like the words we use every day, are the results of a hard-fought battle. You are a part of that battle. Every time you speak, every time you write, and every time you define your own path, you are using the tools of the Grammatical Institute. The story of Noah Webster is finished, but the story of the American voice is still being written by you. The companies thought they had buried the truth with Molly Magia, but they forgot one thing. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. It doesn't disappear just because a person dies. It stays in the bone, screaming its presence to anyone who knows how to listen. Enter Dr. Harrison Martland, a medical examiner who refused to be bought. He realized that the girls weren't dying of a disease, they were being poisoned from the inside out. Radium is a calcium mimic. When the girls swallowed the paint, their bodies thought the radium was calcium and sent it straight to their bones.
Once there, it settled in and began firing alpha particles, microscopic cannonballs, into the surrounding tissue at point-blank range, 24 hours a day. To prove this, Martland did something revolutionary and gruesome. He exhumed the body of a deceased dial painter. In a darkened room, he took a piece of the girl's bone and laid it on a sheet of unexposed photographic film. He left it there for days. When he developed the film, it wasn't blank. The bone had photographed itself. The radiation coming from the skeleton was so strong it had burned an image onto the film through the dark. This was the smoking gun. Martland had proved that the girls were walking, breathing radioactive sources. The company scrambled. They tried to discredit Martland. They tried to hide the medical records, but they couldn't hide the ghost girls anymore. 5 women in New Jersey, led by a brave woman named Grace Fryer, decided to sue. They were so weak they couldn't even raise their hands to take the oath in court. Some had to be carried in on stretchers. They were literally dying in front of the judge. They knew they wouldn't live to see the money, but they didn't care about the money. They wanted to make sure no one else would ever have to lip, dip, and paint again. The courtroom in 1928 looked like a scene from a horror movie. Grace Fryer and 5 other women, Albina Larice, Quinta McDonald, Edna Hussman, and Catherine Schaub, became known to the world as the Radium Girls. The defense lawyers for the United States Radium Corporation used a brutal tactic: the delay. They knew the girls were dying. Every week the trial was pushed back was a week closer to the plaintiffs disappearing forever. One lawyer even argued that because the girls had waited too long to sue, the statute of limitations had run out, even though the girls didn't even know they were poisoned until their bones started to break. But the media didn't look away. The newspapers called them the 5 women doomed to die. Public outrage began to boil. For the first time in American history, the little guy wasn't just fighting for a paycheck. They were fighting for the right to work without being murdered by their own tools. The company's CEO took the stand and claimed he had no idea radium was dangerous. This was a lie. Years earlier, the company had issued thick lead aprons and tongs for the male scientists in the laboratory to protect them from the rays, while telling the teenage girls at the benches that the paint was safe enough to use as lip balm. The pressure became too much. In the summer of 1928, just before the trial reached a verdict, the company buckled and offered a settlement. Each girl received $10,000 in cash, a fortune at the time, a $600 annual pension, and coverage for all medical and legal expenses. But the victory wasn't about the money. The settlement changed the law. It established the right to sue for occupational diseases. Before the Radium Girls, if you got sick from your job, it was considered your problem. After them, it became the employer's liability.
Grace Fryer died only a few years after the settlement, but her fight sparked a fire that couldn't be put out. Because of the Radium Girls, the U.S. government created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, decades later. Every safety warning you see on a chemical bottle today, every pair of safety goggles in a lab, and every hazardous materials sign exists because 5 women in New Jersey refused to die in silence. Even more incredible? During the Manhattan Project, the secret mission to build the atomic bomb, scientists used the data from the Radium Girls to set the safety limits for handling plutonium. The women who were poisoned by the first miracle element ended up saving the lives of thousands of workers in the nuclear age. They are still with us. If you go to the cemeteries where the Radium Girls are buried and take a Geiger counter to the grass above their graves, the needle will still jump. They are still glowing, still warning us a century later. The story of the Radium Girls didn't end in the courtroom. It moved into the most secretive laboratories in world history. In the 1940s, when the United States began the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb, scientists were terrified. They were working with plutonium,
an element even more dangerous than radium. They didn't know how much radiation a human body could handle before it started to fall apart. They had no data. Then, someone remembered the ghost girls. A group of scientists, led by Rob Lee Evans, went back to the survivors, women like Catherine Donahue, who was still fighting her own legal battle in Illinois. They didn't just want to help them, they wanted to study them. These women became the human calibration for the nuclear age. By measuring exactly how much radium was left in the women's breath and bodies, scientists were able to set the first tolerance dose for radiation. The safety protocols used to protect the scientists who built the bomb and the workers in every nuclear power plant today were written using the measurements taken from the radium girls. Chapter 7. The Final Stand of Catherine Donahue. While the New Jersey case was famous, the fight in Ottawa, Illinois was even brutal. Catherine Donahue had been fired for being sick. The company told her she was lazy. By the time her case reached the Industrial Commission, she was a skeleton covered in skin. She was so weak that during her testimony she collapsed, but she refused to stop. She brought her own death jewelry, the glowing watches she had painted, into the courtroom to show the judge. She won her case in 1938, but she died just days after hearing the news. She didn't live to spend a single penny of her settlement. But because of her, the company was forced to admit that they had knowingly lied about the safety of their factory. The Radium Girl Legacy Checklist. If you are telling this story to an audience, here are the heavy-hitter facts to include. The lip-pointing fact. The girls were told to use their lips because it saved time. The company prioritized seconds of production over decades of life. The half-life tragedy. Because radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, the women buried in the radium cities will remain radioactive until the year 3500. The legal pivot. This was the first time in history a company was held responsible for the long-term health effects of a job, not just immediate accidents. Chapter 4. The Retreat and the Bounty. A War Without Peace. The Great Emu War of 1932 didn't end with a treaty. It ended with a humiliated Major Meredith boarding a train back to the city, his machine guns packed away, and his reputation in tatters. The global press had caught wind of the story, and the headlines were merciless. From London to New York, the world laughed at the image of the invincible British-trained military being outsmarted by giant chickens. But for the farmers of Western Australia, the retreat was no laughing matter. The 20,000 emus were still there, and they were hungrier than ever. The guerrilla stalemate. With the army gone, the emus became even bolder. They learned the sound of truck engines and the glint of sunlight on metal barrels. They weren't just birds anymore. They were a seasoned occupation force. They continued to trample the wheat, and the veterans, men who had survived the mud of the Western Front in World War I, found themselves facing total financial ruin at the hands of a flightless bird. Twice more, in 1934 and 1943, the farmers petitioned the government to send the army back with even heavier weaponry. But the government, fearing another public relations disaster, refused. They realized that high-tech military hardware was the wrong tool for an ecological problem. The bounty system, a new strategy. The government finally realized that if you want to win a war in the wilderness, you don't send soldiers, you send incentive. They switched from a military model to a bounty model. They offered a cash reward for every emu beak turned in. This turned the entire local population into snipers. Unlike the soldiers who stood in the open with rattling machine guns, the locals used stealth. They knew the watering holes, they knew the migration paths, and they were motivated by the need to put food on their own tables. The results were staggering. In just 6 months in 1934, over 57,000 bounties were claimed. The unkillable army was finally thinned out not by heavy artillery, but by thousands of individual farmers protecting their own land. The emu's ultimate revenge. The irony of the Emu War is that while the birds lost the Bounty War, they won the Linguistic War. To this day, the Great Emu War is cited as history's greatest example of asymmetric warfare, where a superior force, the army, is defeated by a simpler, more adaptable force, the birds. The emu was never removed from the Australian coat of arms. It stands there today, opposite the kangaroo. Why? Because neither the emu nor the kangaroo can walk backwards easily. They were chosen to represent a nation that is always moving forward. But for Major Meredith and his 2 Lewis guns, moving forward meant fleeing from a flock of birds that refused to follow the rules of human combat. The Emu War remains a humbling reminder. Nature doesn't care about your technology, and sometimes the birds win. Chapter 5. The Most Dangerous Man in History. A new story begins. As we leave the dusty fields of Australia, we move to a story that is much darker and far more consequential. If Noah Webster built the language of America and the Radium Girls built the safety of the world, this man, Thomas Midgley Jr., nearly destroyed the entire planet, twice. He was a brilliant chemist with a friendly smile, but he holds a record no one wants. He has had more impact on the atmosphere than any single organism in Earth's history. The knocking problem. In the 1920s, cars had a huge problem, engine knocking. When you pushed the gas, the engine would rattle and shake, eventually breaking itself apart. The giant car companies like General Motors needed a solution. They turned to Midgley. He discovered that if you added a specific substance to gasoline, the knocking disappeared. The engine ran smooth as silk. The substance was lead. Midgley knew lead was a deadly poison. The Romans had died from it. The Renaissance painters had gone mad from it. To hide the danger, he and his bosses gave it a catchy, safe-sounding name, ethyl. They never mentioned the word lead in their advertisements. Soon, every car in America was spewing invisible poisonous lead dust out of its exhaust pipe and into the lungs of every man, woman, and child. But Midgley wasn't done. His next miracle would involve the very air we breathe. While the Earl of Sandwich was busy eating at the table, the world was about to face a climate disaster that would change literature and technology forever. In April 1815, a volcano in Indonesia called Mount Tambora erupted. It was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. It threw so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that it literally blocked out the sun for the entire next year. The Gothic Ghost. In the summer of 1816, it snowed in New England in June. Crops failed globally. In Switzerland, a group of writers, including Mary Shelley and Lord Byron, were trapped inside a villa because it was too cold and rainy to go outside. To pass the time, they had a contest to see who could write the scariest story. Because of that volcanic ash, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. The birth of the bicycle. But there was a more practical invention, too. Because the crops failed, there was no oats or hay to feed the horses. Horses began to die or were eaten by starving families. Without horses, people couldn't travel. A German inventor named Karl von Drais needed a way to get around without a horse. He invented the Laufmaschine, running machine, a wooden frame with 2 wheels that you pushed with your feet. This was the ancestor of the bicycle. A volcano erupted in Indonesia, and because of it, we got the monster and the mountain bike. History is full of disasters involving fire, water, and wind. But in 1919, the city of Boston faced an enemy no one saw coming: sugar. Specifically, a giant 50-foot-tall steel tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of raw molasses. The Purity Distilling Company had rushed the construction of the tank, and it was notoriously leaky. Local kids used to bring cups to the tank to catch the dripping syrup. The tidal wave. On January 15th, a sudden rise in temperature caused the molasses to ferment and expand. At 12:40 p.m., the rivets popped like machine gun fire, and the tank disintegrated. A wave of molasses 25 feet high roared through the streets of Boston at 35 miles per hour. This wasn't like a water flood. Molasses is non-Newtonian. It is incredibly thick and heavy. As the wave moved, it smashed buildings off their foundations and tipped over an elevated train track. People and horses were trapped in the sticky goo, unable to move. As the air cooled, the molasses began to harden, acting like quicksand. The aftermath. It took weeks to clean the city. Sailors used fire hoses with salt water to wash the syrup into the harbor. For decades, residents claimed that on hot summer days, the entire north end of Boston still smelled like brown sugar. The disaster led to a massive legal battle that resulted in the first state laws requiring registered professional engineers to sign off on major construction projects. Every time you see a stamp of approval on a building blueprint today, you are seeing a legacy of the Great Molasses Flood. While Boston was cleaning up molasses, the world was being rewired by a man who lived entirely inside his own head: Nikola Tesla. If Thomas Edison was the businessman of light, Tesla was the magician of energy. He didn't just want to light a bulb, he wanted to power the entire planet without wires. The AC-DC War. Tesla arrived in New York with 4 cents in his pocket and a letter of recommendation to Edison. But the two geniuses hated each other. Edison used direct current, DC, which was weak and couldn't travel long distances. Tesla invented alternating current, AC, which could be sent hundreds of miles via transformers. To discredit Tesla, Edison staged public demonstrations where he used AC to electrocute animals, trying to prove it was deadly. Tesla responded by letting 200,000 volts of AC pass through his own body in a dark room to light a bulb in his hand. He won. The Wardenclyffe Dream. Tesla's ultimate goal was the Wardenclyffe Tower. He believed he could use the Earth's own ionosphere to transmit free electricity to anyone with a simple antenna. He wanted to give the world wireless power in 1901. But his investors, including J.P. Morgan, realized they couldn't put a meter on a wireless signal. They pulled the funding. If you can't charge people for it, the free energy wasn't worth building. The Descent. Tesla spent his final years living in a New York hotel, obsessed with the number 3 and falling in love with a white pigeon. He claimed he had invented a death ray that could melt airplane engines from 250 miles away. When he died in 1943, the FBI immediately seized all his papers, fearing his superweapons would fall into the wrong hands. We live in Tesla's world. Every time you use a remote control, a neon light, a radio, or an induction motor, you are using the mind of a man who died alone and penniless because he was thinking 100 years too far ahead.
In 1944, as the Allied forces prepared to liberate Europe from the Nazis, they realized they didn't have enough men to be everywhere at once. So the U.S. Army did something brilliant. They recruited artists, actors, and sound engineers from New York and Philadelphia. They formed the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army. The inflatable invasion. Instead of real tanks, these soldiers used inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, and airplanes. From a distance or from a Nazi spy plane, a field of balloons looked like a massive armored division ready to attack. The science of sound. It wasn't just visual. The Ghost Army had massive speakers mounted on trucks that could be heard 15 miles away. They played recordings of tank engines, soldiers shouting, and bridge-building equipment. They were so good at sonic deception that they convinced the German High Command that 30,000 men were moving toward them, when in reality there were only a few hundred artists with air pumps. They saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 lives by tricking the enemy into defending the wrong places. Their existence was kept top secret for over 50 years until it was finally declassified in 1996. For centuries, historians and scientists have argued about whether ancient miracles in religious texts were based on real events. In the book of Joshua, there is a famous passage where the sun is said to have stood still so the Israelites could finish a battle. In 2017, researchers at Cambridge University used astronomical dating to look at this story from a different angle. The annular eclipse. They realized that the Hebrew word used in the text, dome, can also mean to become dark. By using complex math to track the orbit of the Moon and Earth back thousands of years, they discovered that a major solar eclipse occurred on October 30th, 1207 BCE. This fits the timeline of the ancient Israelites in Canaan perfectly. To the soldiers on the ground, the sky suddenly going dark and the sun disappearing behind a ring of fire would have felt like time itself was stopping. It is now considered the oldest recorded solar eclipse in human history. During the American Civil War, Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, had a secret weapon in his own home. He just didn't know it. Her name was Mary Bowser. To the world, she was a quiet, illiterate servant working in the Confederate White House in Richmond. In reality, she was a highly educated Union spy with a photographic memory. The Invisible Woman. Mary was born into slavery, but was freed and sent to Philadelphia for an elite education. When the war broke out, she volunteered to go back south as part of a sophisticated spy ring. Because Davis and his generals believed that black people were incapable of reading or understanding complex politics, they were incredibly careless around her. They would leave top-secret military dispatches, troop movement maps, and private letters sitting right on the dining table. The human Xerox machine. While Mary was dusting the furniture or serving dinner, she was reading everything. Because of her photographic memory, she would memorize the documents word for word. At night, she would slip out of the house and pass the information to the Union underground. In 1977, NASA launched 2 spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, on a one-way trip out of our solar system. Today, they're the farthest man-made objects from Earth. But they aren't just flying pieces of metal. They carry a message in a bottle for the universe. The Golden Record. Earth's greatest hits. NASA knew that if an alien civilization ever found the Voyager, they wouldn't speak English. So, a team led by Carl Sagan created a 12-inch gold-plated copper disc containing sounds of Earth, thunder, bird songs, a mother's kiss, and a heartbeat. Music, everything from Bach and Beethoven to Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good. Greetings, hello in 55 different languages. And the map, a diagram showing our location in the galaxy relative to 14 pulsars. The longest goodbye. The Voyager probes are now in interstellar space. They have enough power to keep talking to Earth until about 2025. After that, they will go silent, drifting through the vacuum of space for millions of years. Even after our sun dies and the Earth is gone, the Golden Record will still be out there. A tiny gold-plated memory of what it was like to be human. Chapter 28. The Man Who Saved the World. Stanislav Petrov. On September 26, 1983, the world almost ended. We didn't know it at the time, but we were only minutes away from a total nuclear war. Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at a secret Soviet early warning center.
Suddenly, the alarm screamed. The computer screen turned red. It showed that the United States had launched 5 nuclear missiles toward the Soviet Union. The gut feeling. Petrov's orders were clear. If an attack was detected, he had to report it immediately to his superiors, who would launch a massive retaliatory strike. But Petrov hesitated. He thought, if the Americans were going to start a nuclear war, why would they only send 5 missiles? He suspected a computer glitch. He had no way of knowing for sure, and he only had minutes to decide. The false alarm. He decided to report it as a false alarm to his commanders. He sat in his chair, sweating, waiting to see if he was right or if a nuclear fireball was about to hit Moscow. He was right. The air, quote, missiles were actually sunlight reflecting off the tops of high-altitude clouds in a way that confused the Soviet satellite sensors. Because one man decided to trust his intuition over the computer, you are here today to read this story.